Thanks so much for having me. I'm Paul. I'm a general internist at Penn State, was said. Um, what we're gonna do for the next hour is not talk about how to write objectives, not talk about how to facilitate a problem-based learning group, not talk about how to use lesson plans to create a session that is engaging for the learners, all of which is super important. What we're going to talk about is the perspectives that we bring from our background, and what our teaching identity, what our teaching worldview is. I had the opportunity to sit down with Lee this morning, and I understand that your medical school is organizing around three aspects of identity in the curriculum: the identity of a master adaptive learner, the identity of a scientist, how we bring the scientist identity into our work as clinicians, and the identity of a systems thinker. I love that. And I will say, in my work with the students at Penn State and before that at Baylor, these things were either implicitly or explicitly working their way into my teaching too. So identity, I think, is a really important part. And this is the opportunity for us to think of our identities as teachers. And so what we're going to start with is the teaching perspectives inventory. So what I would invite everybody to do, and I'm gonna give like 5 minutes to it till about 12:10 or so, to do the teaching perspectives inventory. This is a battery of questions. You can get to it through either the link that's on the slide or the QR code. There's a bunch of demographic introductory kind of screens to go through. Go through those as fast as you can till you get to the beliefs, the intents, and the actions questions. And you want to fill it out about one instance of your teaching. In order to get usable data, you need to be thinking about one time you were teaching over the last month. And it can be any venue in which you teach. If you're a clinician and we're teaching on the wards, if you're a scientist and we're working with grad students in your lab, that's fine too. It just needs to be one aspect of your teaching activities that you do. Think about that one aspect as you're filling it out. So I'll give you a couple of more minutes and then we'll start unpacking what we see. When you get to that final screen, it gives you sort of a PDF with a bunch of bar graphy kind of things. Just sit on that screen because that's what we're going to work with. Yeah, we'll tell you this falls. About one more minute, then we'll start. So when I was looking for a picture to put on sort of the top level slide for this, knowing that we're going to talk about teaching perspectives and teaching perspectives inventory. I really like Escher's drawings because Escher was all about what you see depends on what your perspective. So in this particular one, whether the guys are perpetually going up the stairs or going down the stairs kind of depends on the perspective that you're bringing to it. And that goes for teaching too. So here are the objectives for today. I'll give you a minute to read them. And we're going to be talking about a number of different perspectives on teaching. The guy who did this work originally was a guy named Dan Pratt. He's a professor emeritus at the University of British Columbia. I have my signed copy of his book here, but I will point out, to me, the key piece of his book is the subtitle, which he calls Mapping a Plurality of the Good. And if Dan were here, I'm guessing what he would say is that no perspective is good and no perspective is bad. There's 5 different perspectives and they are all equally valid and they describe what we're bringing to our work as teachers. I find myself these days trying to incorporate aspects of all the perspectives into my teaching, but I know that I have certain defaults that when I'm not thinking or when I'm under stress, I'm defaulting toward. So what we're going to talk about as we get into the teaching perspectives is I tend to take a simplistic view of teaching and learning, and I boil it down to 2 sets of activities, which are interrelated and they bleed into each other, but I tend to think about them separately in my mind to keep things clean. And those 2 sets of activities are design and execution. So design, if you were doing a problem-based learning activity with students, design would be the case that you write, and execution would be you're facilitating the students in that case. And your teaching perspective impacts both design and execution. It sits underneath the way you design or the way we design and the way we execute. And so we're going to consider both design and execution and their intersection with perspectives. Here's a quote from Pratt's book. I'll give you a minute to read it. I find the idea of the lens through which we view teaching and learning being critically important. And I took the TPI probably, I don't know, 15 or 16 years ago. And if I would have taken it when I was just out of residency 30 years ago, I'm confident that my TPI profile would have looked much different than it does today. part of this idea of a master adaptive learner is that true masters are never done working on their craft, which I put in my bio. I couldn't even remember that I put that in my bio, but it's not an accident that that was the first line of my bio, because when you meet with Dan Pratt, who's one of my top 5 teachers of all time, Jed and I have watched him teach, and he is breathtaking the way he works a classroom. When you talk with Dan Pratt, it becomes clear within about 15 minutes that as good as he is, he's not done working on his craft. And so not only are we not done working on our craft, we're also not done thinking about what the craft is and what it's all about and how teaching and learning actually work. Okay. Does everybody have a TPI profile sheet now? You should have, the thing should have spit this out at you, which is your TPI profile. Here is an example TPI profile. There are 2 lines. I can't point on the screen. There are 2 lines. I'm pointing at, actually there's 3 lines. I'm pointing at the top line and the bottom line. These are the line of dominance and the line of recessiveness. The middle line is the mean line for you, and everybody has a different set of 3 lines, and they may be closer or farther apart, depending on how your answers were to the questions. Each box represents one of the 5 perspectives, and we'll get into what the perspectives are in a minute. And if you have a box that is at or above the top line, that is your dominant perspective. It is possible to have 2 dominant perspectives. If all your boxes are on the same line, if all your boxes are the same height, chances are you weren't thinking about one particular thing when you filled it out. So you might want to go back and try it again. But most people have 1 or 2 dominants, have 1 or 2 subdominants. So this particular person is developmental dominant, and they have subdominance of apprenticeship and nurturing, and they have recessives of transmission is close to being recessive, and social reform is recessive. So that means this person, when they're designing stuff, when they're actually in the classroom executing, when they're on the wards, teaching on the wards, is going to tend toward a more developmental perspective in the way they teach. Okay. Oh, yeah, let me bring in the, all right, that's what I want you to. Okay. Everybody got a handout. Now, just by way of example, what we're doing right now with me talking at you would be most consistent with a transmission perspective. Now, I will tell you that transmission is my recessive, so I'm feeling pretty uncomfortable right now. And I'm going to be in transmission mode for about 2 more slides, and then we're going to get into my sweet spot, which is developmental. The question is, there are these 5 perspectives. These 5 perspectives come out from several hundred interviews that Pratt and his colleagues did more than 30 years ago with teachers across Canada, and a whole lot more actual observations of those teachers teaching. And what they realized is that people really sort of have 1 of 5 or some combination of 5 belief systems. And sitting underneath those belief systems is a conceptual model for teaching and learning. And this is that conceptual model. And it has 6 elements on it. It actually has 7, but it has 6 main elements. 3 of those are the teacher, the content, and the learners. And the other 3 are the lines, X, Y, and Z, that connect that are various connections between the 3. So you get a line between learners and content, you have a line between teacher and content, you have a line between teachers and learners. Sitting in the background is ideals. Ideals tend to be your view of the big picture that has to do with the content that you are teaching. So How many people are basic scientists here? Do you got any basic science? So basic scientists, as you are teaching the Krebs cycle, remember your ideals might be different with a grad student than they are with a medical student. And I know the basic scientists at my institution that I talk with, they get uncomfortable when they're teaching the medical students because they're like, I don't know how this plays in medical practice. And what I usually say is the way to think about your content with these future doctors is you've gone to doctors. Which ones do you like? And how would you project that those doctors would use this content when they're doctoring with you? That's sort of the underlying field that sits underneath it all. But really, 4 of the 5 perspectives have to do with the other elements on the model. I'm going to show you 2. And on your handout, you have all 5. So you have the conceptual model. And each perspective has its characteristics for what it's like, but each perspective also has its challenges. So one of the challenges of the transmission perspective is keeping people engaged. Our associate dean for curriculum and I like to stand in the back of the classroom sometimes when a lecturer is lecturing and ask, is it education or is it edutainment? Because the History Channel is really good edutainment, and it comes in one ear and it goes out the other, and tomorrow I don't remember anything about it, but it was really fun to be in at the time. So it's good edutainment. And sometimes our lecturers are not good edutainment, sometimes they're edutainment, but what we want is education, meaning those learners need to be thinking as we're talking. And one of the challenges of the transmission perspective is how do you know? How do you know whether they're thinking or not? So here is the transmission perspective. The transmission perspective prioritizes the line Z. It prioritizes the relationship between the teacher and the content. And what the teacher is doing is organizing the content and delivering it to the learners. So the line goes from teacher through content to learners. The learner is the final recipient of the content. I'm going to give you the one that I think is farthest from transmission perspective now, and that's developmental. This would be the essence of something like PBL. In developmental, the priority line is between the learners and the content directly. The learners directly engage with the content, and now the teacher engages the content through the learners rather than engaging the content directly. What Dan always said to me is the essence, Dan Pratt always said to me was the essence of the developmental perspective is that the teacher puts themselves out of a job. By the end of the semester, the learners should be so good at engaging with the content that they no longer need you anymore. So you see how these 2 different perspectives look almost like polar opposites of one another. And the nurturing perspective and the apprenticeship perspective have variations on that. And the social reform perspective is really about raising learners' awareness of the social forces. So the one unique one is the social reform perspective, which goes through the ideals to both learners and content. And I will say that what Pratt would say is it's a vast minority of teachers who are dominant on the social reform perspective. Okay, that's the crash course. Let's look at this through, we're going to look through design, and then we're going to look through execution. So what I'll ask you to do is get into groups of 3. So find 2 other people around you and say hello to your friends and your group. Folks who are on Zoom, we're going to be putting you in 3 breakouts. How many people are on Zoom? 28. So we'll be putting you in 3 breakout groups on Zoom. So that'll be your group. Okay. Now, the folks that are on Zoom, I'm going to put what happened there? Oh, that's, you're just
Okay,
making the
breakout
room.
room.
Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna throw up a slide. Don't start the breakout rooms until people that are on Zoom, take your camera and take a picture of the slide, so you have the question, so you can talk with it, so you can talk about it. Okay, so here we go. So we're on design. Our first question is gonna be, I wanted learners to better know the mechanisms of common drugs used in psychiatry. Can we move that a little bit?
Yes.
Just move it over into the purple. All right, so I wanted learners to better know the mechanisms of common drugs used in psychiatry. So I created an interactive comic book about the characters Glutamate Gwen and Dopamine Dan, and distributed this to learners to use during their psychiatry lecture series. And then I compared their scores on the psych shelf exam to a historical cohort. Now, these questions are not super clean, and that's by design, but the question is a simple one. Which perspective is my method most compatible with? Developmental, apprenticeship, social reform, transmission, or nurturing? So you have your cheat sheets, which is the handout, so you have all the perspective. I'm gonna give you 3 minutes. 3 minutes in your group. The rules are you need to reach consensus on one answer and one answer only. Be prepared to discuss why you think that answer is better than the others. Go. Folks on Zoom, we're sending you into the breakout rooms to reach consensus on an answer.
Innovative way.
Well, I'm looking at all of them, because all of them do start with a teacher.
Yeah, but through the content.
No, I did not. I actually had.
Yes.
There you go.
Yeah.
But they're using interactive. There's not a guide.
Can we do? No, what is it? Oh, what is it?
That's when you take your ideas. I did this down here. I was thinking more along. You're getting.
Wait, let's, okay, that's it. Let's read it.
I might change it to ready. Should I talk
All right, 1 minute warning, 1 minute to come to your final consensus.
But then you have that process of filtration. It's amazing. If it works for you. That's so interesting how we all three.
We're in the content.
Okay, let's bring it together. Let's bring the folks in the chat rooms back to Zoom. All right, here's what we're gonna do. One person from each group is the answerer. And you've got 5 choices. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I'm gonna count to 3. And at the count of 3, you're gonna hold up your hand with which number your group chose. Folks that are on Zoom, what I want you to do is throw the number that your group chose into the chat bar.
Okay, can we pause, it's taking about 30 seconds for the.
Oh, it's got the 1 minute before we kick you back? Okay, okay, so this gives you 30 seconds more to have final arguments.
Final answer.
Stretch practice.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay, we back?
3, 2, 1.
Okay, Zoom people, welcome back. I'm gonna count to 3. What you can do on Zoom is start throwing your answers in the chat box, 1 through 5. Folks in the room, here it comes. 1, 2. You should know who's gonna answer. The answer person knows what hand they're putting up. 3, hold them up. 1, 2, 4, 5, 1, 4. So we are everything except for social. All right,
It was accurate.
what do we got coming in the chat box?
We've got 1, 2, 4, 2, and 2.
Okay, so we're all over the place. So, somebody here in the room, tell us what your group was thinking. Folks on Zoom, throw into the chat box your thoughts for why you chose what you chose. Okay, somebody go.
All right, I'll be the brave one.
Speak real loud so the Zoom folks can hear you as well. Go ahead, here and
You
then
start
here.
talking, I'll let you go.
So we were torn between 4 and 5, and so I just raised the hand for 5. But I think when you are looking at, you know, how they're creating this story, it's providing like a nurturing connectivity component to the learning and generating that interest in them. So I think it's more nurturing, but it is transmissive at the same time.
So kind of a nurturing, transmission-y kind of thing going on, yeah? Go ahead.
We picked apprenticeship because when it did start with the instructor creating the thing that they were gonna do, that's that content delivery. So we kind of looked at our maps and said, okay, it's one of these things. So we figured they were going to the content first, but then it was the learners engaging. So it was giving them a little bit more onerous on them to come back, which, let me get they're in the process of enculturation into a community of work.
Yeah, I love that. I usually think of the apprenticeship perspective as see one, do one, teach one, only I replace teach one with get feedback on one. So I show you it, then you do it, and I give you feedback, and we go through iterative loops like that. So I'm seeing all of that here, except for maybe the iterative feedback loop, but you can build that into the comic book itself. What else? Other folks, what are we thinking?
Yeah, we said transmission just again, because basically it seems like the teacher takes the content, organizes the content, and then produces the content to the learners in a very particular way. And so it seemed, I think, more direct, I guess, in terms of that arrow. It seemed to be that backwards feedback to the teacher.
When we were discussing that, it was inspiring to, or aspirational to be number 1, developmental, but it was falling short, it was becoming more transmission because of that aspect. If the students were to create this tool themselves, then it would become more developmental kind of approach.
And realize what we're getting into here. I do agree that, as the teacher, you are organizing the content and handing it to the students. Think of the conceptual model. Now it's you and the content coming to the students, as opposed to students directly intersecting with the content. Sometimes we say the students are not ready to engage with the content, they'll get it wrong, and my job is to ensure that they get it right. Have you heard this or felt this before? That is essentially a transmission perspective view of it. You all know the first rule of teaching? Learners will perform up or down to your expectations. So if you want learners to perform better, you need to raise your expectations. Now, how often do you hear medical students aren't ready for this yet? You hear that? Learners will perform up or down to your expectations. So if you lower your expectations, they'll perform worse. Now, let's talk about our learners for a minute. This is medical school. Okay, I'm gonna ask you to divulge trade secrets, so, if you tell me your secret, I'll tell you Penn State's secret. How many applications do you get for your medical school? 6,000 for for how many slots?
56.
For 56 slots. Okay, we get about 8 for 140, so your numbers are even more competitive than ours. Okay, these are the Ferraris of learners. If I were to give you a Ferrari, would you take it out and drive it at 20 miles an hour?
Yes.
If I were to give you a Ferrari and a closed track with no other cars, would you drive it 20 miles an hour? Right? Y'all, we're working with the Ferraris and learners, take these babies out, see what they can do. Learners will perform up or down to your expectations. Which is one of the challenges of the transmission. Yeah. Anything else for this one before we move on?
We struggled between developmental and nurturing. We thought it could have been either one, but we ended up going with developmental because it said, I created an interactive comic book, and it's like a good teacher creates scenarios that engage learners with content. We kind of focused. I think that's kind of what tipped it for.
The essence comes to what the interactivity looks like, whether it's tipping from transmission to developmental. Don't ask me what the right answer is. There is no right answer. You could play this any way you want, but it's the way we're conceptualizing the perspectives. I will tell you, Penn State has once again purchased osmosis for all the medical students. Do you all purchase anything for your medical students? Which one do you buy? UWorld, osmosis, UWorld? So we just got osmosis. So the osmosis people were, giving us their spiel and taking us through the videos. And I teach a bunch of different content, but I'm gearing up to do evidence-based medicine in the fall. So I'm looking through all the evidence-based medicine content, and the osmosis videos are slick. And they built a lot of stuff into their platform from the last time I looked at it. Now that the big giant Elsevier owns osmosis, they built all kinds of stuff into that platform with space learning and blah, blah, blah. And I'll tell you, that person giving us the spiel had all the buzzwords. She was talking about cognitive load, and she was talking about self-determination theory, and she was talking about all of it. And at the end of the day, it is a really slick video authored by osmosis people. It's a transmission perspective with all the strengths and weaknesses that the transmission perspective brings with it. Understand what you're dealing with here. And it fuels that medical student perception of efficiency, which I find not necessarily compatible with the way human beings really learn, but that's just my opinion. So realize if you're going to use osmosis videos, you're starting with a transmission-y thing. And if you don't want to be transmission-y or you want to be something else, and neither is good or bad, there's the perspectives are neutral, but you need to think about what your objectives are. Because if that osmosis video is a prelude to a problem-based learning case, realize your learners are going to experience a transmission mode of teaching, and then they're going to go immediately into a developmental mode, because I think of problem-based learning is primarily developmental in its mindset. Okay. How are we doing? 12:36. You know what? I'm gonna skip the second one. We'll send you the slides. But you can look at that one on your own time. Because I want to get us to execution. If I can advance the slides. Try this one. Okay, so here we are on execution. This one's kind of complex. It's got a bunch of different things built into it. But okay, so now we're gotten off design. So design is what you're going to do before you get in the room with the learner. Now we're going to go to execution. We're going to go on to the awards. How many people are clinical teachers here? Okay, For the people that aren't clinical teachers, if you're basic scientists, think about the parallel perhaps with a grad student learning some technique in the lab. You're rounding on a patient with interstitial lung disease, and you and the student are discussing that the patient has dry rales. The medical student asks you, how can you tell the difference between wet and dry rales? And you have your option of one of these four different response choices. The question is, which of the perspectives are represented by each response choice? So you're gonna look at the four and we're gonna go through the four and say, what perspective does this look like? So response choice number one is the student says, what's the difference between wet and dry rales? And you say, how do the words wet and dry relate to lung diseases? And you use that question as an entree into probing the student's past knowledge to help them discover their way to a new working knowledge of the pathophysiology underneath wet and dry rales. Okay, choice two, student says, what's the difference between wet and dry rales? You and the student both then go to the patient, listen to their lungs, you have the student describe what they're hearing, you tell them what you're hearing and how the sound comes about given that patient's interstitial lung disease, how the pathology works. Number three, student says, what's the difference between wet and dry rales? You say, dry rales generally sound like Velcro and wet rales generally sound like blowing bubbles through a straw. So you go home tonight and try these two things out. And choice number four, a student says, what's the difference between wet and dry rales? You ask the students, what experience, if any, do you have with hearing high and low frequency sounds? And to this question, the student responds that they were in the marching band throughout high school and college. So now you and the student make a plan for them to Google wet and dry rales. You can Google these and there's actually some nice recordings on the internet. I checked it out. So you tell a student to Google wet and dry rales and check out some of the sound recordings on the internet tonight and come back tomorrow with a musical metaphor from their past experience that they can use to decide whether I'm hearing wet or dry rales on the rounds. Okay, we clear with what the four different choices are to respond to this student's question? Okay, with your group, 4 minutes, 1 minute per response choice, decide what perspective each of those response choices are most compatible with. Folks on the Zoom, go talk about it on Zoom.
I feel like number three.
Yes. Well,
So-
what about
Programming boxes and stuff.
And so, but I was thinking, what would you do?
I would do,
I would do two, but now I'm gonna.
I was doing it. I mean, I would love to.
With like.
Two cents.
And honestly, I might actually do three and then like when I answer your question. Yeah.
Yeah, so three's transmission, that's.
Okay, so is
But I feel like.
I know, how is that?
You're putting the question back to you.
Yeah, so with you just want.
The learning is certain.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I just wonder. Yeah.
It does not mean they.
But there, I mean, it looks like some folks in every. It's interesting. Yeah. Think about sometimes overestimate the
Okay, 1 minute warning, 1 minute to finish up your discussion.
This also.
How much time till the Zoomers are back?
29 seconds.
29 seconds. You got 29 seconds left.
The pressure's on.
That's Billy Joel's song. From, what was that from?
Oh, that is a different.
That's a different one.
It's a good one.
Yeah, that was clean.
Now I'm down. Oh, yeah. Breakout. Closed.
All right. I realize we're running short on time, which is giving me ideas for how I'm gonna change this question for this afternoon. But let's go through them as fast as we can with what perspectives are going on here. And again, nothing is super clean. So yeah, this isn't the textbook book, this is real world. Number one, what perspective we think that is? Why are you saying developmental? It's not about the what, it's about the why. If you thought that was developmental, why do you think it's developmental? Go ahead.
Because they didn't actually give the answer. They put it back to the student and said, why do you think it's like, how do you know what wet and dry is? Like made them go back to their past knowledge instead of just saying this is the difference.
What do other folks think?
We have
Do we
another
agree?
vote for developmental in the chat.
You're shaking your head no.
We had difficulty with this one. We saw elements of nurturing. This one.
What specific elements did you see of nurturing?
Well, they're asking increasingly complex questions. And trying to provide some context, but really creating high standards. And going from the wet and dry question to the more detailed question, looked like it was progressively getting more challenging.
I've always personally found the nurturing perspective to be the most difficult one to wrap my mind around. It's the one I continually say to Dan Pratt, is this nurturing? And he's like, yeah, not really. And the way I've come to think about it is in number one, we're gonna get to nurturing in a minute. In number one, you're looking at the content through the student looking at the content. So you're asking the question that's trying to unlock what's in that student's brain about this content, and then try to put a question in front of them that leads them more toward your understanding of this content. Or the truthful understanding, the truth is out there kind of thing, which feels kind of developmentally. You're making the student engage with the content directly, and you're sort of shaping that engagement. As opposed to the nurturing perspective, which is where you get to know the student. So you prioritize your relationship with the student and then use that relationship as context to set goals. Okay, number 2, what do we think number 2 is? I'm hearing lots of apprenticeship. Why?
Because you're both doing it. That's kind of the seeing you, see you, with a little bit of that interaction, that feedback loop.
See one, do one, feedback one? Yeah, yeah. Number 3, what does that look like?
Transition.
Student asks a question, you answer the question. Classic transmission. So realize what we're getting here. It's not just, it's almost like design in the moment. Student asks a question, you have multiple avenues as a teacher for how you deal with that question moment. You can answer the question with a question that feels developmentally. You can answer the question that feels transitiony. Those are bookends for the spectrum. Number 4, what does number 4 look like? Why?
Making that connection.
Right, but look at the difference between 1 and 4, which is squishy. 1, you're asking the student about what they know about the content. 4, you're asking the student about who they are as a person and trying to leverage what strengths they're bringing to the issue of wet and dry rails. It's still about wet and dry rails, but now you're bringing the student's personhood into it as a way to engage them with the content. Okay. Hang on.
Always.
You know.
It works right before.
You know, that's how it is.
That's because the Zoom thing got moved. I think then it became a Zoom connection versus a PowerPoint. I hear you.
This is a grid from, are you all using any team-based learning? TBL? Not by the Microsonian TBLE. This comes from the Team-Based Learning Collaborative. You want to see something that'll blow your mind? It's very developmental. So think of your TPI, but check out the Team-Based Learning Collaborative. I have no financial association with the Team-Based Learning Collaborative. This is a grid for facilitating. I think it's about more than team-based learning, but this is a grid of all the different things that you can do when you're executing either in a classroom or on the wards. And it organizes according to different tasks of teaching and different moves that the teacher could make. Jazz musicians always talk about, how many people like jazz? Yeah, that's about average. Everybody thinks jazz musicians are making it up on the spot. Is that a general consensus? What they're actually doing is jazz musicians have little riffs. They have little snippets of melody in their head, and they're speaking a language with one another, a language that's foreign to most of the public, but they're stringing together riffs. So the better jazz musicians have a bigger vocabulary of riffs, and they're more eloquent in pulling them out on the band scene. These are our execution riffs as teachers. And I would encourage you tonight to take a look at this and ask yourself, which ones of these do I do a lot of? And which ones of these do I not do a lot of? And the not do a lot of ones might be ones you might want to practice and try to make part of your repertoire. And as you look at the ones that you don't do a lot of, ask yourself, which ones might be more uncomfortable for me to do? And then look at your TPI profile. Because I would argue that many of these align with different perspectives on the TPI profile. And the ones you don't do, or the ones you might find uncomfortable doing, might be ones that align with your recessives on your TPI profile. Your TPI profile is not fixed, as your identity is not fixed. It is a constantly evolving thing. So as you think about your development as a teacher, both in terms of design and execution, you want to think about what are my strengths? And what do I not have right now that I want to build into my teaching repertoire? Okay. we're down to the conclusions. Which is in the spirit of trying to be developmental, because that's my dominant. I'm not gonna tell you what the conclusions are. You're gonna tell me, what conclusions are you drawing from this session? Folks on Zoom, throw them into the chat box.
I take away being intentional and being aware of the aspects that I'm pulling out.
I love that. To be intentional about your craft is to work on your craft. Yeah, I love that. What else?
Yeah, our particular profile is predisposed to the use of certain risks that we've used successfully over the years, and there are opportunities to really expand those out by trying on different identities as
We all have our strengths, and we all have our defaults. You're gonna work on your craft, it's probably time to start working on some of the blind spots. What else?
Putting structure around some of what we all do and being able to name it creates a common vocabulary, so that when we're talking with others about what we want to do in a team-based environment, we can all more quickly kind of understand what our goals are.
I love that. You all are an academy of educators, is that, so do you get together and do your secret handshake and do academy things?
We can't tell you.
This could be one set of shared vocabulary. The 5 perspectives could be your set of shared vocabulary, working stuff together. Absolutely.
I think it's also important knowing which of those is gonna help the learner the best based on where the learner is in their own journey. Because sometimes they really do just want the answer. Like that would just be the most helpful thing in that moment. And then another time, the more probing thing is gonna be more helpful to them. So knowing where they are and what's gonna help them at the most, but having that repertoire to be able to bounce around.
I've been leading a project at 7 different medical schools that the paper needs to be written. That we made with Dan Pratt an adaptation of the TPI for students, so that we could see what students' perspectives on what they perceive good teaching to be are. And there's some interesting results there. The students are kind of all over the map, but a lot of them are nurturing dominant.
I did hear a little bit as I was walking around the room, but some folks saying, I'd love to do number 4. I'd love to be, be able to have the time to do that, but you just always don't have the time to do it. You see that as like ideal.
Every system is perfectly designed to get exactly the results it gets. If you are in a system that is not giving you the time to be a nurturing dominant person, and your profile is nurturing dominant, the question becomes, how do I do nurturing in that setting? So I would love for you to rewrite number 4 for me as a nurturing move that is doable in your system.
My thought on that is when you're rounding and seeing a variety of different patients, you may be able to use the nurturing for one example, one patient, and although you would like to do that every single time, because of the time you're limited, so it's a little bit of having to pick when you employ the piece that's gonna take longer.
I love the idea of doing number 4 once, and then when you get to the next patient, turning to all the students and say, write down what your thing is. Now go home tonight and think about your relationship of your thing to this and what's gonna be your learning activity. And then maybe tomorrow before rounds, we'll share 1 or 2 of them. Right? So sort of working with the time constraints that the system's putting on you. Okay. Last slide is just an acknowledgement of Dan Pratt, from which the 5 perspectives spring. I find this framework really valuable to think, particularly in where I'm going in my work, is thinking about the improvisation aspects of teaching. Working on perspectives that I don't have has given me riffs to use. So thank you very much, and I will be here up front for any conversation afterward. Thanks for coming out.